So we're going to be working on John 11 together today. So if you guys want to turn to your Bibles, you're welcome to. Many of you that have studied this or maybe gone through this passage kind of know the direction that this is going to go. So a little bit it's somewhat somber, right? Especially some of the topics that we're praying for today around just healing and, the presumption of maybe, possible passing of loved ones, and that's really hard. And so as a young man sitting in front of you, I'm no stranger to that myself. I think many people have someone close to them that has passed. And so this can be really tough. And so this passage actually opens up a lot of questions. But what it also does is it provides lots of answers. And so hopefully this will be good. So when I talk more about my personal story, so when I was about 22, my father passed away. And so my dad was one of those dads that was super great. He was my best friend, but he suffered a pretty major injury. And he was like the man's man, always working on cars. He restored an 1800s chuck wagon. So he was always good with his hands. Obviously, I didn't pick up a lot of that, but I appreciated the hard work that he would put in. But because of his injury, it obviously put him in a very dark space, and he felt the need to relieve what he perceived as his own pain and find kind of his way out. And so it was a shock to our entire family. It was certainly a shock to me. And so with that, I woke up that morning, I went to work, and I'll tell you honestly, I had this like sick gut feeling in my stomach. I just knew something wasn't right. Something was wrong with this day. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I went. And about halfway through the morning, probably about 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning, my ex-wife received a phone call, and she actually called my boss, and I saw my boss, who actually sat directly in front of me, his face just dropped, and he had to leave the room. And he's like, "Hey, Denise is on her way. She's going to come pick you up for lunch." And I'm like, that seems strange. Why wouldn't she just call me, right? And so she got there, and she called him again and said, "Hey, can you send him out?" So I ran out to the van, and I hopped in, and I could just tell something was wrong. And as soon as I saw her face, I was like, "He's gone." And she's like, "Yeah." And I tell you what, I reacted in such a way that I'm kind of embarrassed, but I think I punched the driver's side dash so many times, I was convinced I could get the airbag to go off. And I was just angry, right? I was just full of rage. I just couldn't understand it. I went through a lot of different emotions at that time. One of just feeling loss and dread, one of just feeling like, should I have caught this sooner? Could I have saved him? And I even went through a little bit of just like, man, my dad, the guy that I loved, like, is he a coward? Like, I feel like he took the cowardly way out. And so I went to his actual church because his pastor had called me and said, "Hey, Aaron, before you go to the house, why don't you come talk to me?" And so I went there, and I remember just on the steps of the church inside, I just sat down and I was crying, and I was just like, "I just need you to answer me one question. Like, did my dad go to hell?" And he's like, "No." He's like, "That is a misnomer. Some people think that. Some people associate suicide. There are actually other faiths that teach that is exactly what happens." He goes, "But I can guarantee you, your dad loved Jesus. We went through the word many times together. Like, I have no doubt in my mind that he's in heaven." And so that obviously helped me quite a bit. I was one of those that when they asked who I wanted to ask to be a pallbearer for my father, I said, no one else can carry my dad if I'm not going to do it. So me and my brother, I have a younger brother, Andrew, we carried that together with a few other family members. And I just even remember even that time, like that was probably, I enjoy lifting. That was probably the heaviest weight I've ever tried to carry in my entire life. And so that was really hard. And so, I mean, a lot of what I'm sharing with you, right, very personal to me, but I'm sure every one of us has some sort of similar story, has had similar feelings. Death is a very, very touchy subject, and it's very, very difficult. But what's great is how it all ends, right? We'll get there. So the one thing I want to remind us all is there are the 5 stages of grief. Maybe you guys have heard these. They're denial, they're anger, bargaining, depression, and then finally acceptance. And what's unique about these is that there's no timeline, there's no time frame, and there's no set order as to how these happen. And so, as you maybe enter in with someone who's maybe going through something like that, just realize that, right? That they're all dealing with their own, and they're going to have their own type of experience through each one of these stages. So with that, though, we get into what we know already about John 11. In John 11, there's going to be this amazing miracle that takes place, right? And we've heard about other miracles by Jesus, right? Some of our favorites, right? I think, Christina, turning water into wine, that's got to be My wife, yeah, that's my wife's favorite, right? That's great.
Can I get it in?
Yeah. Walking on water, healing blind people, healing leprosy. I mean, and simple things. Him speaking words, a woman who just touches him, right? There are all these great miracles. And so we start to associate these different miracles into areas around timing, demonstrations of supernatural, right? And so this is really important when you start to think of all of the aspects of what goes into a miracle, specifically the timing, right? Because the timing isn't unique to us, it is according to God's timing. Every single miracle that happened, going back to the first miracle that we all appreciate, again, water into wine. Jesus even announces to it's not my time. I only do this through what my Father wants. And it was only then that he admitted, like, okay, we're going to start this path now. We're going to go ahead and do this miracle and essentially save this wedding, right? So definitely more around timing. Walking on water, right? We can say that's more supernatural, right? Because physically impossible for anybody ever to hover above water and physically walk across, right? It just does not happen. But in those miracles, right, there were actually 3 times, and I actually did a study into this. I knew of Lazarus, but I didn't realize that he'd actually risen 2 other people from the dead. So I wanted to share that with you too. So we have, he raises a widow's son from the dead in 9, where he hears about and sees this kind of funeral procession and sees that very heavy casket and reaches over and touches the casket and says, rise, and the procession stops and he rises upright. He brings him back from the dead. A second one is Jairus' daughter back to life, right? He hears that as well. He goes down to the bedside. He even reminds her, like, hey, it's okay. She's just sleeping. And the Jews that were there laughs at him. So he kind of tells him to go away. And then he tells her to rise up, right? And so again, all this supernatural, awesome power that God has of just showing his demonstration over his divinity over death. So let's jump into what is actually John 11 here. So we'll start with that verse, right? So now a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and his sister Martha. And it was Mary who had anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, and it was their brother Lazarus that was sick, right? So what John's trying to do is he's trying to kind of set sort of the stage, the location, as well as those that are going to be mentioned throughout this passage, right? So with that, Bethany, so the location of Bethany, for those of you that may know or not know, it is adjacent to kind of the Mount of Olives, right? So it's sitting over Jerusalem in this very hilly area. And, the Mount of Olives obviously is an area of serenity. It's a place that Jesus often went. And Bethany was a town where these 3 would live. So again, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, right? And he makes it very specifically talking about the oil and the time that Mary sat down before him and basically used that the perfume and cleaned his feet. Because in the Testament, there are several Marys that are actually listed, right? We know of a few of them. Obviously, the Virgin Mary, right? Jesus' mother. We know Mary Magdalene, okay? And we even know Mary, another Mary, the wife of, is it Clopas? Am I saying that right? Clopas, yeah. So he wants to very distinctly, hey, this is Mary, right? The Mary that we know. So then we go on to say, so these sisters sent word to him, saying, Lord, behold, him who you love is sick. But when Jesus heard this, he said, this sickness is not to end in death, but for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified by it. Now, Jesus loved Martha and his sister and Lazarus. And so this is really important, right? Like, of course, we know Jesus to be the man who loves all of us, right? So why is he making this very specific statement? And he being John, why is John saying this about them? So the relationship between Jesus, Martha, Mary, and Lazarus these are like his best friends, right? So I want you to imagine your best friend. I want you to imagine their home, right? A place where you can go, kick off your shoes, just completely relax to get away. I mean, we all probably have a relationship like that where you can go somewhere. And so this is meant to be very, very intentional as John is bringing up this relationship and who these folks are to Jesus. So then we move on. So when he heard that he was sick, he, Jesus, then stayed 2 days longer in the place that he was. Then after this, he said to his disciples, let's go to Judea again. So the reason why he waited 2 days is very specific because now we're setting up a very intentful timeline. So the distance between where Jesus was and where Bethany was basically about a 2-day travel. So as the sisters sent these messengers to go tell Jesus about Lazarus being sick, it was about 2 days for them to get there. So then there's another essential 2 days as Jesus is waiting before he goes. Right? So there's going to be about 4 days, and we know later on in the passage they actually say that Jesus knows that Lazarus has been basically deceased for 4 total days. And so why is this important? Because we have basically the 6-day time window, 2 days for the original messengers. Jesus hangs out for 2 days, so now we're at 4, and then it's going to take Jesus about 2 days to get to Bethany, right? And it's going to do that reverse travel. And the reason why that is because back then, first century, there is some that say that they used to believe that there might be a kind of an open window of time for a possible resurrection. Some people even say that as the body was there and the soul would depart from the body, that the soul might hover above the body and wait for the change of the body before actually moving on, right? Knowing that that person had died. We also know that Jesus has made reference to 3-day resurrection, right? His own, right? I'm going to destroy this temple and then I'm going to raise it again in 3 days. So the idea that we're going to have this 4 days of death for Lazarus is going to be very, very important because it's not the Messiah's death. It's not the Messiah's resurrection. It'll be very, very different. So please keep that in mind as well. All right, so he said, let's go to Judea again, right? These are Jesus' words. And the disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and basically you want to go back. So like this is nuts, right? Rod taught us this last time we were all together. Jesus basically makes that great claim that one of the major I am statements of I am the Father, or I and the Father are one, and they thought this was complete blasphemy. And if you remember the actual verses, then the Jews picked up stones because they were going to stone him, right? So this is what they're referring to. Like, listen, these people are looking to hunt you down. You've made these claims, like, why on earth would we want to go back? And Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not with him. So this is kind of an interesting one. I needed a little bit of help, and Rod kind of helped me through this as well, but kind of just sharing, like, this again is just talking about God's timing. So in a traditional workday that many of us are familiar with, right, there's usually the 12 hours of light and 12 hours of the evening, right? And we know the Jewish day kind of ends as sundown's happening, right? So this is very important thing that work needs to be done in this duration of time. And so Jesus being very intentful to share with his disciples, like, hey, there's these 12 hours of light. There is work that needs to be done. I'm not worried about that. I walk in the light. I'm going to go and do this very important work. I'm not concerned about that. But anybody who doesn't really believe is almost like one, or doesn't believe in God's timing, is one that is just like somebody that's trying to work at night, right? And all the pitfalls and dangers and potential hazards that could happen for somebody that works in the evening time. Essentially, that's what he's trying to share here. So this he had said, and after that he said unto them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go so that I may awaken him out of his sleep. And the disciples then said to him, Lord, if he's fallen asleep, he will recover. Now Jesus had spoken of his death, his again being Lazarus, but they thought he was speaking of a literal sleep. So Jesus then had to reply to them very plainly, Lazarus is dead. So for believers, there is this notion of when those that pass, they do go to sleep, right? Or are found asleep. We see this in 1 Thessalonians 4:14, where it says, for if we believe that Jesus died and rose from the dead, so also God will bring him those who have fallen asleep through Jesus. Okay? So moving on, we see that now we're going to talk a little bit about Thomas, right? So therefore Thomas, who is called, help me out with this one, Rod. Didymus, okay, sorry, thank you. Yeah, Didymus said to his fellow disciples, let us also go so that we may die with him. So this is a very brave statement, right? He's basically saying, Jesus, we're going to go alongside you, and if there's this presumption of, potential danger, like we'll be able to be there to die at your side, like. And I just thought that was pretty inspiring. Like, that's exactly what I would want to say. I think that's what we would all want to say. Now, reality, I don't know. We kind of find out later. The reality, definitely no. So here we go. So then when Jesus came, he found that they had already been, or that he had already been in the tomb for 4 days, right? Again, we kind of talked about this timeline, the 2 days there, 4 days that Lazarus has been dead, right? And many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. So they kind of had these like professional grievers, which was kind of interesting. They would actually sit with the families and grieve over the loss of their loved one. And so they're pointing out that there are basically other folks present beyond just family that are obviously grieving and spending time here with Lazarus, right? And not Lazarus obviously in the tomb, but they're spending time with the family. So Martha, therefore, when she had heard that Jesus was coming, went to meet him. So this is kind of cool too. So again, remember, if you can picture in your mind kind of the Mount of Olives, right? This very hilly mountain area just east of Jerusalem. Bethany is up here as well. And so in order for them to travel, part of that travel meant they had to kind of take this route that allowed them to kind of work back and forth as they're making their way up to the city of Bethany, right? So they're going back and forth. So they could see from Bethany for miles. So it was very, very important for folks to know that, like, obviously she saw him coming, saw the caravan of people coming with Jesus, and so she made her way out to go greet him. He hasn't necessarily just like made it to her doorstep and she sees him and goes. I think sometimes people read it literally that way. There is this actual geography that's being kind of walked through, and so she sees that and makes her attempt to go out to greet Jesus. Martha, so coming to Jesus, right? Martha then says to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." And this just breaks your heart, right? This is exactly like we all feel, just that desperation, that like, my best friend, my loved one, my brother, like, I know you are God, right? And she's just, just grieving. And so she's sharing this with him. So even now I know whatever you ask God, God will give you. And Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again, right? Another very extremely bold statement. So what does Martha do? So Martha says to him, I know that he will rise again in resurrection on the last day. So this is important too, because Martha believes that there will be an ultimate resurrection, right? I know when I read this, I was like, okay, she believes in Jesus, his best friend. Of course, she knows of kind of this coming resurrection and his power of that. But honestly, she doesn't yet, right? The time in that hasn't come just yet, right? We're going to see this amazing miracle, and we'll actually see, Jesus kind of share a little bit more. But she believes, like many others, that there will be some sort of a resurrection. Even I talked to you about even as they believe that maybe a soul hovered over the body for a time, they believe that there might be an opportunity at some point, right? Some sort of like resuscitation or something for someone who had passed. So she believes in that. It's kind of this common understanding around resurrection. And so we need to go a little bit deeper, right? So in John 5, there is this that Jesus says, do not marvel at this, for an hour is coming in which all who are in the tombs will hear his voice and will come forth. Those who did the good deeds to a resurrection of life, those who committed the evil deeds to a resurrection of judgment. Deuteronomy continues to support this, and that's 32:39. See now that I am he, and there is no gods besides me. It is I who put to death and who give life. I have wounded, and it is I who heal, and there is no one who can deliver from my hand. But she, again, going back to Martha, she doesn't believe that Jesus can do this right now, right? She's still thinking about kind of more this future context of maybe a possible resurrection to come, right? She doesn't really understand or believe who Jesus is quite yet, right? Her faith is still lacking. Remember, this is a point in John, what Rod has shared with you, what we're learning about now, this is all about dealing with people's unbelief. Throughout the entire scripture of John, there's a constant reminder of so that you will believe, right? Believe, believe, believe. And this right now is really dealing with those that don't believe. So then we jump back into, so Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even if he dies. Okay? And again, this is super important, right? I am the resurrection and the life. So again, this is going to be one of those great I am statements. And anyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? So a couple things here. We just remembered about the good shepherd when he was talking about, right, those that hear his voice, those that will have eternal life. He's referring to this yet again. Not only that, but Jesus is very intentional with his words. Everybody knows that. He asks these very powerful statements where the question really is yes or no, right? So do you believe this? And so she goes on. She says to him, yes, Lord, I have believed that you are the Christ, the Son of God, even he who comes into the world. When she had said this, she went away and called Mary, her sister, saying secretly, the teacher is here and he is calling for you. So remember, back at their house, there's those professional grievers, other Jews that are there. So she goes back to tell her sister, hey, I've talked to Jesus. Here's what's going on, and so on. And so immediately she does what? She hops up, right? She's ready to go see Jesus for herself. When she heard it, she got up quickly and was coming to him. Now, Jesus had not yet come into the village. Remember, he was making his way up, kind of approaching the city. So he was still in the place where Martha had met him. So the Jews are witnessing this, right? They're witnessing one sister leaves, the next sister gets up quickly, she's leaving. And so the Jews are seeing this, and they're thinking, in an attempt to console her, that she's going to be going back to the tomb to weep for Lazarus, right? But she doesn't go there, right? She immediately makes a beeline straight for Jesus. So therefore, when Mary came where Jesus was, she saw him, and she fell at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. It's the same thing, right? Again, this grieving sister who's dealing with the loss of her brother. And when Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in the spirit and was troubled. And so I think this is something for all of us, right? Like all of us have these desperate emotions that we're dealing with, especially as it relates to the matter of death. And we're overcome with this grief. And Jesus loves us, right? This is his opportunity since the fall of man that he's walking with his people. And here he is seeing his best friends who are just sobbing and just beside themselves, dealing with this emotional death of their brother. But what's also interesting here is it says that it moved him deeply, or he was deepened and moved, and then in the spirit he was troubled. And in this trouble, it's really referring to more like an anger. Like the Aaron that has just learned about the death of his dad and wants to punch the airbag until it goes off, right? Like he is anger. But he's not necessarily angry at kind of the circumstance surrounding it because he knows, hey, I'm going to defeat all of this. But it still troubles him, though, that it exists in the first place, right? That there's the existence of sin and death and that we're all having to go through this. And he knows that, right? And so for him, his spirit inside him is just angry. It is ticked off. Do you want to put a curse word in for me, or am I good? Okay, just want to make sure. Only you can get away with that. I can't, so, okay, great. Right? So we'll continue on, right? So, and so it said, where have you laid him, right? So immediately he's going, okay, I need to go to the tomb. And they said to him, Lord, come and see. And then this is the moment that Jesus wept, right? This is the moment where he's like, okay, with everything that's going on, and as angry as I am, I remember being a little boy getting into fights with like neighborhood kids, and I would get so angry that I would just start to cry, right? And I would start to shake, and it just bothered me so bad. I could see Jesus in this moment that finally he just kind of lets everything that's going on around him, and he takes the moment to weep. And it isn't just a, tearful, hey guys, can you just hand me a tissue? Like, yeah, this isn't good. He, like, gut-wrenching pain, you're seeing Jesus visibly weep and just, right? It just got to him as it gets to all of us. So the Jews were saying, see how he loved him, right? It's fathomable to, like, they still just don't get it, right? The Jews are looking at him and they're just seeing this emotional outburst, if you will, from Jesus, and they're still just saying like, oh man, he must have loved him too, right? That type of thing, right? They just don't quite get it. They're not connecting the dots just yet. But some of them said, could not this man who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man, being Lazarus, also from dying? So Jesus, again, being deeply moved within, came to the tomb. And so this tomb is kind of what we all can kind of picture in our minds, right? It's a cave, and it would have this stone lying against it. And some of the stone was obviously to keep, any intruders from coming in, anybody that wanted to disrupt the body or interrupt it, but it also served another very big purpose. So Jesus says, remove the stone. And Martha's obviously, she goes to him, right? And she's just like, Martha, the sister of the deceased, says to him, Lord, by this time, there's going to be a stench. Like, this is going to be bad. That's the reason why we have the stone, right? As soon as you move that, all the bad that you can imagine is going to come out, and it's not going to be pleasant, right? So she's trying to save everybody, like that embarrassment. And Jesus said to her, did I not say to you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? Again, yes or no? So they remove the stone, and then Jesus raises his eyes and says, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me, but because of the people standing around me, I say it so that they may believe that you sent me. Man, that is awesome. I'll admit one of my biggest weaknesses is prayer. I struggle with that, and I'm so grateful for great prayer warriors and so on. Like, it's something that evades me. But just to see that Jesus, right, like he's in constant communication with God, like he's part of that. But just taking that moment, not only to pray and express the discipline of what prayer really is, but then just to say that out loud so that everybody around him could hear exactly what he was intending for them to see and experience. So they would see the glory of God. Let's see. When he had said these things, he cried out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come forth." Now this is kind of funny, only because I've heard other commentators say this. Like he could have just said, "Come forth," but some people say like his power and his divinity over death. If he had just said, "Come forth," there might have been other people other than Lazarus that stood up, right, and started walking toward him. So he's very intentional to call out Lazarus by name. Remember, as he kind of talked to the young girl and said, "Child, rise." When he touches the casket, he also tells that young man to also rise, right? So he speaks directly to them. And the man who had died, so this being Lazarus, bound hand and foot with wrappings on his face and wrappings around that were, cloth wrappings all around him. Jesus said to the people around him, "Unbind him and let him go." And therefore, many of the Jews who came to Mary, again, remember those kind of professional grievers, those people that are with her, with what they had saw and what he had done, believed in him. And that's amazing. Again, we want to go back to the purpose of miracles and timing, supernatural, that type of thing. This is all done right now in front of them so that they would what? So they'd believe, right? What's also kind of cool is when you start to translate some of the words around belief. So it's the ancient Greek word. I know Rod kind of gave us this word study, the pisto, which derives from belief, or pistis. This is basically means more of like to persuade someone. It carries out a connotation of deep trust and confidence. And again, remember Mary and Martha, they believe in Jesus, but I still think this is the moment, right, where we start to really see that deep trust and confidence in what he can do. And the other Jews that are witnessing are seeing the same thing. But one thing that's really interesting about this is as you begin to see some of the translation is that not only is just believe, but that they would continue to believe, meaning this is going to continue to go on through all time, not just in that moment, but they would continue to believe in him, that now us getting a chance to go through his word, that we would continue to believe. So this is really important. And so then the last part, but some of them went to the Pharisees and told them the things which Jesus had done. And obviously, as you continue down through this is more about kind of where we start to see the plot begin to develop around how they want to murder Jesus, right? So with all of this, again, all of us are going to be encountered at some point, either dealing with our own ending, right, or dealing with those that are around us and what that means. And it's okay to go through the stages of grief. And it is okay to be angry and ticked off. It is okay to feel all of that. But it's how we act and then what we believe and what our takeaway is. And if we will continue to believe that Christ is the resurrection of our lives, that because of our baptism, like it talks in Romans, that we're buried with him, that we rise up again with him, right? That is what's important. And so, let's talk about the great memories. Let's talk about our loved ones, both past, present, but we can also talk about them in the future.